in any case. So welcome to today's talk. So I'm Loredana Polezzi, and normally, but also today, this is my one of my classes, and it's a class in which we talk about Italian American culture, and we talk about ethnicity, and we talk about all kinds of other issues of representation. Hi, Aidan. And this week we have a guest here, and it's a guest that I'm really glad to have with us in person. I'll say a little bit more about her in a second, but I should also say that this event today has been organized and has been co-sponsored by a number of units and of people across the university. So Languages and Cultural Studies, the Mato Chair, which is myself, but also the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication, and also the Humanities Institute, and also Women, Gender and Sexuality have all sponsored or supported this event because it's so interesting and it's a topic that cuts across so many of our interests. So Dr. Joanna, she answers to both of those names, and Joe as well lately. So Joanna Chojnicka. You see, I want to say it the other way around. Chojnicka. It's just I have renamed her, and it's my own personal sort of fantasies when it comes to names, whatever. But Dr. Joanna Chojnicka is currently a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Cardiff in the UK, where she's been working for now 2 years, a good 2 years, yeah, on a project of which she will be speaking in a second. But it's a project that brings together a number, as I was saying, a number of questions and a number of themes that are dear to all of the people in this room. So questions of language and translation, questions of transnational representation, cultural representation, and questions of gender and sexuality in particular. So she'll be talking about this today in her talk, which is Dr. YouTube, Multilingualism and Multimodality in Gender Transition Narratives on Polish Social Media. And we will also have space after her talk for anyone here to ask further questions. Over to you, and then we'll return to the audience when you're done. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you. And first of all, thank you to Loredana and Agnes and Paco and the interns and everyone who has been so amazingly welcoming. I'm really glad to be here. So I will be talking about multilingual practices. To be honest, I do not think that we will have time to discuss multimodal practices. I have rehearsed this and it's 50 minutes long without the multimodal practices, so I think we will drop that. Unless you're really interested, then we can come back to that. But I will focus on the multimodal kind of multilingual part of this talk. And as has been mentioned, this is part of a project that I'm working on now. You can see the title of the project on the screen. I have to mention this for formal reasons, that this research has been funded by Marie Curie Actions under Horizon 2020. It's a European program to fund research, and I need to give you the project reference number, so here you have it, the number. And there is also a QR code, so maybe, this is this day when the person presenting actually asks you to take out your phones and to play with them a bit. So this QR code will actually take you to the Facebook page of my project. And because this is a project that relies on community outreach and working with the communities and kind of co-creation and co-dissemination of the project results, this will help me a lot if you could follow the page. But of course, if you do not want to do it before I am actually finished, because you don't know yet if what I will say makes any sense, you want to see how it goes, we can also come back to the QR code when we're done with the talk. But I will take now 5 seconds to drink my water, and you can admire the QR code. Okay, so just 2 sentences about the project itself before we dive into the topic for today. So in this project, I look at the role played by multilingual and translation practices in constructing discourses around gender and around sexuality. And I look at the way speakers, in particular social media creators in Polish, resolve the tensions between the global discourses about gender, on sexuality, and the local understandings that have existed in that particular socio-political context. So before we dive in, I would like to ask you for some participation. So do you know any trans YouTubers, trans YouTube channels? So of course they would not be in Polish. And I should also mention now, this is a good moment while you're thinking about all your YouTube experience, that I will not be using Polish material in this talk because the Polish YouTube channels that I look at are relatively small, and I do not think that it would be justified for me to add to their visibility with my research. And due to the very kind of unfortunate social, political and cultural circumstances in Poland, I consider this group to be very vulnerable. So you will not see any fancy screenshots and kind of any interesting bits and pieces. You will have to believe me when I say how interesting they are. I do have some screenshots, but they actually do not have any people in them. And of course, you will not see kind of the names of channels, so you will not be able to find them, at least because of me. But I will show you some examples just so that we kind of understand what kind of media we're talking about, what kind of social media, what kind of narratives we are talking about. I will show you some channels that I consider to be very, very visible, and you know, these are channels that have millions of followers. You might be already familiar with them, and they are also run by people who are very kind of who are also active offline. So I think it's justified because there has been also a lot of research on those channels already, and I do not think that they will suffer because of the increased visibility from this talk. So now the time for you to tell me all the beautiful YouTube channels that you know. Any examples? Any names? Yes, very good. Yeah, I do have that in the presentation. Anything else? Yep, have her as well. Very good. Anything else? We will watch a tiny clip from that. You're really hitting the nail. Anything else? That I don't know.
She's already famous.
That's probably why I don't know her. Okay. Good. Then let me show you some examples that I have brought. So Saniati has been mentioned. Ty Turner or Chase Ross. These are really pioneers of trans YouTube, as I will be calling it today. And these are also the channels that have inspired the Polish YouTubers. They really do refer to these channels as their sources of inspiration. And what these channels have in common is the fact that they are all created by a single YouTuber, right? So each channel belongs to one person. And these are usually these kind of talking head formats, right? So it's a person sitting in front of the camera. We can see the head, we can see the shoulders, usually a microphone. And the videos are usually staged to kind of suggest that they are shot in the bedroom or in other private space, right? So this is a very kind of informal and very personal conversation that the creators are having with us, right? That we are invited to their bedroom, we are invited into their home, and it's kind of a one-on-one conversation. Some of the channels that have been mentioned are slightly different. So for example, we have ContraPoints, we have Philosophy Tube, and these are channels that specialize in quite long. I mean, you can see here, for example, the video on the left has, it is 1.5 hours long, and it has 1.5 million views, right? So these are really very, very large and very popular channels. And these channels specialize in long kind of format video essays about philosophy, about social issues, about political issues, right? So here, the fact that the creator is a trans person does not play such a central role. And so if the kind of topic that they are talking about has something to do with trans issues, they will be addressed. But other than that, you know, the fact that the trans identity of the creator is not really in the center of attention. So with these kind of more personal videos, it's definitely the channel exists because the person is transitioning and wants to document that, right? It's as much to document their own private journey as to share it with others, to also maybe be inspired and draw advice from that. So we will come back to Philosophy Tube. I will show you a short clip. And yeah, these are kind of the examples. And the Polish videos that I look at, they are more of the first type. So they are more of the kind of personal, informal channels with very short videos, usually between 10, 20 minutes. And they are definitely in this kind of talking head format where we have the creator shooting from the bedroom and talking about a topic that personally affects them. Okay, so let's have a look at the state of the art. There have been already quite a few papers about this phenomenon. You can see that they are all from the last 10 years, because of course this is something very, very recent, something very new, so you will not have many publications from kind of before 2010. But they are all, let's say, kind of social studies papers, right? And they are not linguistic, they are not discursive. And I am taking kind of more this linguistic or discursive approach. And I would like to take a closer look at the paper by O'Neill from 2014, because that paper really kind of talks about narratives and talks about representation and talks about the kinds of narratives that we can find on trans YouTube. So again, before we dive into that, can you think about types of genres that we could find on those channels? What do you think are kind of the most important topics that they could be addressing? We have 5. Yeah, kind of, I mean, he calls them genres, but just to kind of make it easier for you to think about, let's say, topics. Yeah? Yes, usually kind of most of those channels run by trans men do have that video, which is definitely kind of an established kind of video, which interestingly enough doesn't exist in Polish on Polish YouTube. So I think there is maybe just one person who has talked about this, but it's still kind of, yeah, it's not really something that we see. Was there a hand? So we are kind of talking about the medical kind of, right, documenting the medical transition. So this would be one genre, the documentation of all the medical procedures that are involved. Can you think about that? Yeah, very good. So this could be, on the one hand, maybe kind of describing the personal experience, but maybe also kind of sharing advice, right? How to dress so that the silhouette looks more male or female, things like that. How to do makeup. So that would be the second type. You're doing really well. Yeah?
Advice on binding, advice on getting people down to documents and experiences being gendered for the first time in like an affirming way out in public or being misgendered.
Very good. Yeah. Okay, you're already doing better than I expected. So now we can go and have a look. So of course, yeah, my question was a bit tricky because I didn't explain what I mean by genre, but of course it would be it would get very technical and we would get a bit sidetracked. So let's just have a look at what O'Neill is saying. Yeah, so the 5 genres of transnarratives according to this paper are documenting medical transition. So again, kind of all those videos that talk about the personal journey, the personal experience. And the second one is, yeah, those advice videos, right? Where, again, they use the personal experience, but in a way that could be useful to other people that are maybe experiencing similar issues, right? So it's a bit more kind of maybe generalized. We are still kind of starting from the personal experience, but framing it in a way that is kind of useful to other people, especially living kind of in the same area or in the same country and being subject to the same kind of procedures and rules. And then we have vlogging, which is something different because this format or this genre of those narratives is used when creators want to talk about their life outside of transition, right? And they often kind of emphasize that this is not all I am. This is not, you know, this is not the only kind of part of my life. It consists of so much more. I have friends, I have family, I have a job, I have, you know, dogs, cats. I'm moving to a new apartment, I'm taking a trip, right? So all these elements can also be shown because, of course, next to kind of specializing in those narratives of gender transition, these YouTube videos are also communities, right? And they have followers who are interested in the creator's personal life. And then we have 2 genres that do not exist in Polish. So these first 3 definitely are there. But the anti-bullying narratives and celebrity videos do not really exist on Polish YouTube. Celebrity videos, well, the reason is there are no celebrities who are trans currently or out as trans in Poland and who would be doing YouTube. So that's sad. That's that. But why are there no anti-bullying videos or anti-bullying narratives? So just as an example, so that you know what I'm talking about, are you familiar with the It Gets Better project? Can someone explain what that is? Mm-hmm. Great. I wouldn't be able to say it better. Maybe you want to come here and do this for me. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. So, I mean, let's just kind of emphasize that it was not just a trans kind of thing, but an LGBTQ plus thing. And it was, yeah, as was said, aimed at, I'm kind of repeating it for the microphone, aimed at young people who could be kind of really struggling, right, and experiencing bullying or kind of other difficulties in their school years, to tell them, yeah, just hang in there, it will get better when you get older. And interestingly enough, this project has been translated. It has been kind of localized or adapted in other places. So it actually now exists in, I think, 15 languages. And because some of you are interested in Italian studies, she has 2 papers, one from 2017 and I think one from 2020, about the Italian version of this project, which is very interesting because the title of it, translated back into English, says things change. So it actually does not have this focus on progress, right? The change, that does not necessarily mean for the better, right? Things change, yes, they flow, they are constantly in motion, but it's not necessarily a progressive thing, right? So they can also change for the better. for the worse. And while in the American narratives or American discourses, the focus is very much on individual change, as you said, right? So it's not the system that changes, but it's you who, through hard work, education, you know, studying hard, working hard, it's you who improve your own life. And in Italian narratives, there's much more kind of, there's focus on the fact that it's the system that needs to change for our lives to get better. Yeah, and this kind of project does not exist in Poland. We were actually thinking about it because I was in Poland last week, and we were wondering why this is the case, that this project did not kind of get get translated into Polish. And I think one of the reasons could be that there is no discourse on bullying in Poland, right? So bullying as a discourse, I mean, of course bullying exists, unfortunately, as a social phenomenon, but there is no discourse on it, right? It's not a fixture of discourse the way it is here, the way, you know, it forms kind of a fixture of the discourse on school culture and so on. It does not really function this way in Polish, so this could be one of the reasons why this project did not make it over to Poland. Okay, so now a bit of theory. This will be really, really quick because I know that we all want to get to the analysis and to look at the material. Oh, okay. Okay. So I was kind of inspired to come up with this project or to think about this project by the apparent kind of similarity between the concepts of translation and transition. So in our kind of Western, Eurocentric or American cultures, being monolingual is considered to be the norm, right? Obviously, it's not the experience of the majority of the population, but it is the norm, it's the ideal. And being cisgender is also considered the norm, right? So according to this, being multilingual and being transgender are deviations from that norm, right? And if we take this kind of logic further, then translation is a way to maintain the monolingual order. Because if we're all monolingual, but we still want to communicate with each other, we can do that through translation, right? So if we translate a text, we can interact with it in our own language, and we kind of, the monolingual order is maintained. And the same with transition, right? If we believe that there are two mutually exclusive genders, but there are people who do not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, if they transition, then, you know, they disappear in that gender that they identify with, and the order is restored, right? So that's kind of the simple story. But if we as scholars, as academics and activists, focus on what is actually happening in our communities, in our societies, how people use language and how people perform gender, we may realize that this ideal is an abstraction, right? It's a normative, that's what it is. It is a normative ideal that only exists in our minds, but not really in our everyday lives, not in our practices. So it is, you know, a fact confirmed by many studies that people's everyday practices in using various languages are far from this monolingual ideal, right? Our everyday practices are much more multilingual, and there is much more kind of translanguaging and translating involved. And gender is a spectrum, and there is so much more variety and diversity in gender performances than only those two binaries, right? So by focusing on that in our activism, in our academic activities, we can challenge those norms, right? We can show this is not the actual experience of most people. The actual experiences of most people are much more diverse and much more interesting than just those kind of norms. So So I mentioned the concept of performativity, or performing, right? Performing genders, performing languages. And this is a concept that is very central in this study. So I look at the way gender is performed on YouTube, in my case, and I look at the way linguistic practices are performed and our identities as speakers of various languages are performed. And translation in here is also performative. So the focus is not on the product of translation, but the process of translation, right? And what kind of process it is, what it looks like. So not what the product of that is, but how those translation practices actually look like. And you have here the wonderful quote from Heiko Mochenbacher, which I think explains what I mean with performativity and gender performance very well. So he says that the normative ideal of masculinity is so fragile, basically, that it needs to be confirmed by everyday gender performances, right? So it is, so fragile, so abstract, that it requires this continual production. And the same with our identities as speakers, right? For example, the idea of a native speaker is also quite fragile, and most people's linguistic performances will deviate from what we think a native speaker should behave like and what they should sound like, and so on. So that's kind of the theoretical thinking behind this project. And now I would like to show you a fragment of a video from PhilosophyTube, which I think really captures those ideas so well. And I would like to ask for your help in analyzing that video so that we can kind of do it together. And it's a very long video because PhilosophyTube does that, right? So it's probably something like 2 hours, but I've chose a fragment of maybe 2-3 minutes. And so you will be maybe a bit confused about what's going on in this video. So basically, we will see a man on the stage who's saying goodbye. And we do not really know what kind of, what he's kind of saying goodbye to, or who he's saying goodbye to, where he's going, what's going on. We don't really know that, but it will become clear in the second part of the video. I hope I got the right.
Not changing every day until the end. I really hope that kid who came up to me and said I was a masculine role model won't feel like I've let him down too much. It's been a privilege performing for you all, literally. I've always wanted to cultivate an audience that was kind and curious and open-minded, and I really hope this doesn't change the way you see me. In some ways, I'll always be here. In the last 7 years of videos, all the old ones. If you want to see me, then that's where I'll be. As a performance. A character on the screen. The man who isn't there. Whatever happens, I am incredibly grateful. Especially to all the people who support me on Patreon. I really hope that you'll continue to support this show and the person who will be here after I'm gone. Thank you very much. You have been a wonderful audience.
Something happened on the day he died. Spirit rose a meter and stepped aside. Somebody else took his place and bravely cried, I'm a black star, I'm a black star. How many times does an angel fall?
so glad I don't have to do the voice anymore. Okay. Hello. My name is Abigail Thorne. I'm the creator of Philosophy Tube. I do a lot of characters and visual metaphor and stuff on the show, so for the final part of today's episode, I wanted to drop the act, and for once, just to explain to you what's going on. So, first of all, this is not a joke. This is not a performance. It's not part of the theatre. This is real. I'm transgender. If you've seen any Philosophy Tube before, you might...
Okay, I think that's enough. So what are your thoughts about this?
might have known me by a different name.
So in terms of kind of the theory of performativity, what do you think? What could we conclude from this? So this is very different from your usual kind of from the channels that document the medical transition as a gradual process, right? That where you see kind of gradual changes over a longer period of time. So here, Abigail actually, I mean, there's just so much that we could say about this. Later on in the video, she talks about performing the character of the man for the followers of Philosophy Tube who didn't know that she was transgender. So basically, she already functioned socially as a woman, but for the show, she would put on a beard, put on a t-shirt, kind of ruffle her hair, and she would perform the male figure because she thought that that's what the audience expected, right? And then at some point she decided that it wasn't sustainable, that she can't do it anymore. And then she literally came out, right? There was a scene where she's walking through the door. And I think, if we want to apply the concept of performativity, what is significant is the fact that as she was performing the male figure, she was on a stage, right? And when the second part came and she was Abigail, she was in a completely different setting. It was kind of a home, more like a home setting, right? So it wasn't a theater anymore. It was not a stage anymore. She was her real self. So the male figure was a character, was performed, and in that part there was even those words, right? This is a performance. It was a pleasure performing for you, right? So it was it was a conscious choice to use this kind of vocabulary. And then when Abigail walked through the door, so came out in a literal sense, and she said, this is the real me, this is the real deal. I'm not performing, I'm not acting, right? This is not theater. So I think, we can consider YouTube to be a site of the performance or a site of performativity, right? And various roles are performed. In those kind of more personal, individual channels, what is being performed is the self, right? So those videos are staged to look like home productions, kind of very simple, very personal, and they are the site of the performance of the self. In many of YouTube, Philosophy Tube videos and also ContraPoints, what we see are characters, and they are very marked as characters, right? They have their own names, they have different political stances. So for example, in ContraPoints, there are many videos where Natalie, so the creator of ContraPoints, plays different characters who have different political views, right? And they sit kind of on two different sides of the same table and have a discourse with each other, right? Have a conversation, have a debate. And it's very clear that these are characters, that these are not the real Natalie. Another kind of role that they may be performing is the role of an expert. So I think that through many kind of elements that kind of make up a video, a YouTube video, this role of an expert is taken up, is claimed, is performed. And I have another QR code because I like technology. So because I do not want to focus too much on theory today, this QR code will take you to a kind of a recorded talk that I did about the theoretical aspects of this project. You do not need to watch this, it's very boring, but it has a list of references, so you can read some papers about the theoretical foundations of this project. So here I mention only kind of this relationship between translation and transition and performativity theory, but the project also relies very heavily on post-colonial theory, and especially post-colonial language studies, where there's this whole discussion about the constructedness of languages, and also queer linguistics and things like that. So again, I will give you a second to scan that QR code, and you can just have a look at the list of references, and if anything interests you, you can give it a go. Okay, so I think that we can finally get to the interesting bits. So the actual analysis. Yeah, I do not think that we will have time for the multimodal part, but I would like to show you some of my results when it comes to the multilingual practices. So in this part, I'm interested, as I mentioned before, in the role played by translation or multilingual practices in transnationalizing the concepts of gender and sexuality. And just a short history lesson, the discourses about gender transition arose here, right, in the US, in American gender clinics, and they were textualized, they were fixed, established in the manuals produced by the American Psychiatric Association, right? And these texts then traveled across the world and became the basis for treatment of transsexuality, as it was then known, throughout the world. And they began replacing ideas about gender and sexuality that may have existed in other places. Not that much of that was left in other places because of colonialism, but yeah, it was something that kind of followed those processes. So, in the view of some scholars, this was a very kind of neo-colonial process of taking those American discourses and transplanting them, right? Adapting them to other places, other languages. And this kind of approach casts non-Western people as passive victims of US cultural and economic imperialism, right? So because of the power that the American culture and the American economy have globally, these discourses were accepted. But a different reading, a different interpretation could be that this was not a passive process, that it was actually, or is still, an active process. And that translation, to answer my question about the role of translation, can be seen as an expression of linguistic and political agency, rather than an act of submission to the dominating Anglophone culture. So I try in my study to see the Polish trans YouTubers as agents, right? As agents of the change, of the linguistic change that is taking place. And they have a very important role to play because they are the ones who take those American discourses from their own consumption of the media, especially YouTube, and they are the ones who decide how we are going to talk about these issues in Poland, right? And I think that they are perfectly aware of this, and I think that they do not take those kind of English words, vocabularies, terminologies, discourses, narratives, they don't accept them kind of at face value, but they engage in a very selective process and a very creative process. And I hope that you will agree that it's quite creative and innovative what they do with those vocabularies. So I will show you some examples of that. And this kind of intersection between transgender and translation is not something that we have a lot of publications on. So there was a special issue of Transgender Studies Quarterly from 2016, but other than that, we don't really have that many publications on this. So we have publications about the intersection, or on the intersections between queer and so queering translation, or queer translation, or translating the queer, but not really with the kind of focus on gender identity. So this is kind of the first bit of my results, and we have discussed YouTube so far, but I also looked at blogs, and I think that this difference between what happens on blogs and what happens on YouTube is very significant. So the blogs that I looked at, I found about 30 blogs written by people who identify as transsexual, because that's the label that they used consistently. And these blogs do not really exist anymore. They have disappeared. So I think out of 30, there is just one that still exists and is still updated. And then some have completely disappeared, so they have been taken down, or they haven't been updated since 2018, right? So I would say the kind of the timeline for blogs is between 2010, 2017, 18. So this kind of decade was the peak for blogging for this community. And maybe with the exception of one blog written by a politician, they were all maintained anonymously. So we do not have, pictures, there were no photos, no names, completely anonymous. And most of them were actually written at the moment before coming out. So they mostly focus on the emotional struggles and difficulties figuring out one's gender identity and kind of coming to terms with the fact that, the blogger may be transgender, may need to do something about it. And pretty much all the blogs relied predominantly on this medical discourse that I kind of introduced in a few words. So this is this discourse that kind of considers transsexuality to be a medical problem that needs to be fixed, right? And it's a very kind of essentialist discourse because it assumes that gender is a binary and that being cisgender is normal and healthy and natural, and being transgender is not normal and not healthy, and it needs to be treated, it needs to be cured, it needs to be fixed. So there's also, a lot of those words flying around that words like treatment, cure, right? Illness, disease, and so on. And very interestingly, there are very few multilingual practices. So there's no terminology that YouTube, that the YouTube creators actually really rely on. So words such as dysphoria or coming out do not exist on the blog, on the blogs. And as I said, the bloggers consistently call themselves transsexual. So they say, I am FTM or MTF, right? So I'm male to female, female to male. And interestingly, the term transgender only appears once, but it refers to what we would call today non-binary. So basically kind of the discourse on blogs is that being transsexual means that I transition from male to female or female to male, and anything in between is transgender. So this is not really consistent with the discourse that we have today. And what I find fascinating about blogs is that you can really see that this is the space between kind of the 90s when there was no discourse whatsoever, and what we have now with YouTube and quite a lot of mainstream and alternative kind of discourses around this issue. So it's also very important to kind of to remember those blogs, even though they have been taken down, they have disappeared. And also kind of one one thing that I really remember is trying to explain, so bloggers trying to explain what's happening to them without having that word, dysphoria. It's really fascinating because you can see that they are searching for a word to call what they are experiencing. And there was a Polish word invented by sexologists, right, in Poland, which was completely inappropriate, and they didn't want to use it, but they kind of did not know what else to say, how else to call it. And then YouTube happened, and this is something completely different, right? So here we have all the YouTubers that I kind of follow and look at have come out, right? So they are out. They are activists, so this is a form of activism. Their discourse is has moved on, right? So it does not draw on this medical discourse. It's the kind of discourse that draws on from social constructivism. It's identity-based. So here, being transgender is a perfectly natural, normal, and healthy variation of human gender diversity, right? So being transgender is no longer kind of a disease or a problem to be fixed. What needs to be fixed is society, social attitudes, right? The law would be nice. But also, yeah, some transgender, it is recognized that some transgender people will require medical intervention, but it's not to fix them, right? It's not because there's something wrong with them. It's just so that they can feel more comfortable with the way they look and the way they present. And here we have a whole range of multilingual practices, and as I said, words such as coming out or dysphoria have become pictures of this discourse. And the term transgender is used consistently, and there's no talk of transsexual or anything like that, so this has been completely abandoned. And so the question is, why these differences, right? Why are these discourses so different? And I do think that temporality plays a role. So definitely the fact that the blogs were kind of the first stage of these social media discourses, and YouTube is kind of newer, more recent, it does play a role. But that's not the full story. I think that the affordances of these media also play a role. So the fact that blogs are available to people who are not out, to people who do not want to show their faces, right? That's kind of a better space for those who are still kind of figuring it out. If you want to be on YouTube, if you want to have your own channel, you need to be out, and you need to be comfortable with who you are, right? So people who publish on YouTube, who show their faces on YouTube, have completed the project of the self, right? Or are at least kind of completing it, are in the final stages of it. While blogs were better for people who were kind of still figuring it out. So in a way, it's a shame that the blogs have disappeared, because that space is not available yet anymore. Okay, so this is, sorry, I forgot to fix that. So I have the kind of the second result that I wanted to show you is my kind of classification of the multilingual practices. So this is on the basis of the YouTube videos, 330 of them. So I watched them and wrote down the expressions, phrases, words that I thought were coming from different languages. Then I ran that through the Polish online dictionary, and I excluded everything that was already in the dictionary, because what I was interested in was were the new terms, right? The neologisms, the ones that are not established in the discourse yet. And I divided them into two types: translanguaging practices and translation. So So translanguaging was also further divided into citations and partly integrated and fully integrated practices. So these are basically examples of code switching, right? Where you kind of switch to English and use those English terms. And citations are the ones that haven't changed the form. So they are basically used as in the original. So I have some examples here. For example, brain dead or special snowflake or adult phase. They are all kind of expressions coming from youth culture or associated with modern technologies mostly. Then we have partly integrated practices or expressions. So these are the ones that have been kind of partly adjusted to the Polish spelling or grammatical system or phonological system. So can you actually recognize what words they are? What is the first one? Yeah? Update. And the second one? You just shout it out. Happy. And the third one? Yeah, but in the plural, right? So the plural is, yeah, flashbacks. And then we have fully integrated, where even more interesting things happen. So here we have words that get, for example, suffixes to turn them into verbs that fully function in Polish grammar. So the first one is to hate, and the second one to like. So you can see that the spelling has been changed, but also that they receive that suffix that turned them into a fully functioning Polish verb. And then translation practices. Here we have instances where an expression has been kind of translated word for word, right? So, so instead of kind of taking over the English phrase, we translate it word for word using the words that already exist in Polish. So an example is to nie jest droga, which means literally this is not the way. And this is not the way we say it in Polish, right? So it's basically an idiom which was translated word for word, while the correct way to say it in Polish would be completely different, right? It would be, I don't even know what it would be, but it's definitely not this. Or the phrase wiem, bo tam byłem, meaning I know because I was there. So in this metaphorical sense of I know because I have experienced this, right? So not that I was somewhere physically, but I was in this situation. And here again, this is not something that you would normally say in Polish. And semantic help, so I will not get into the technical kind of distinctions here, but the example mój komputer się. So again, back translated into English, my computer sucks, right? And this is the, so basically, you know, the verb to suck in English has many meanings, and you just take the new meaning, let's say, right? So to suck in the sense of being really bad, and you take the Polish word for that and apply the new meaning to that, right? So that's how it works. And then we have also hybrids, which are kind of a combination of a translanguaging and translation practice. So you have a two-word expression, and you kind of translate one, but leave the other one. So instead of saying, for example, so psi grummer would be dog groomer, right? And you only translate the dog part, but leave the groomer because there is no word for that in Polish. I think I have to wrap this up. So I will just show you, because so far we have kind of been discussing the general terms, let's say, and I wanted to leave the trans-specific terms for the end, so that you can see that diversity and variety that I was talking about. So I will show you these. And what is interesting, kind of the difference between general terms and trans-specific terms, is that when I created these lists, the general terms list was much longer, but these were the terms that were used only once. So these are just kind of spontaneous creations, right? I'm talking about something, I'm talking about a dog groomer, and then I just use that and I never use it again. And the list of trans-specific terms is actually much shorter, but these terms are becoming established in at least this kind of within this online community. So these are actually becoming more fixed and established, and they appear in many different videos. But you can see that there is still there is no established way of, for example, referring to gender, right? So we have different ways of spelling it, and we have different ways of creating verbs. So you can say something like to gender someone, right? Would be genderować. So again, we see this ować suffix that is very productive, and we can really create any verb out of any word just using that suffix. And especially interesting is the last column on the right, which shows you all the different ways that you can refer to trans people. And so this basically uses the trans prefix and then some other form which can also come from English, but it may be in Polish. And some of these are, you have to trust me if you don't know Polish, that they are really extremely creative show that people creating these words have a level of multilingual awareness that comes into play here. So for example, trans bros or trans bros, of course this is a short version of trans brothers, right? But you can also make a diminutive form out of that, which is something that does not exist in English, and say trans brości, which is like little trans brothers, right? Or transiątka, transiki, that's basically just sticking a diminutive suffix to the trans prefix. And this is the same pattern that we use to refer to kind of little animals or children, right? So you can say kot for a cat, but a little cat and a very cute cat would be kocionko, right? Or you can have a child, dziecko, but you can also have dzieciątko, so a little cute super baby. And the same with transiątko, right? Or transik. And this is, by the way, one of those words that have been established in also outside of those YouTube communities, right? So they are really kind of entering the mainstream LGBTQ+ discourse, and they are being used also by people who do not follow those channels. So this is something that, and it's a word that can be attributed to a specific person. So it's really fascinating that that person can say, I actually invented a word, and now all the community is using it. Okay, so as I promised, we will not talk about multimodality because we do not have time. So let's just go on to my inconclusive conclusions. And here are also the promised screenshots from the Polish channels without people, which I'm kind of showing you because I also, so that was kind of connected to the multimodal part. But it also shows this creativity, right? So we have a drawing. So that was from a video about the types of top surgery for trans men. And in this video, we do not see the creator, but we hear his voice as he's kind of narrating the drawing that he's doing kind of while filming, right? So he's making a movie of himself drawing what those different types of top surgeries look like and what the results look like. And the second one is very similar. So here we have a diagram, and if it looks very complicated, yeah, it is very complicated because this is a diagram of the process of transition in Poland. And so kind of the top of it refers to the medical transition, which actually kind of the legal transition depends on, because it is a requirement to have completed some elements of medical transition in order to go to court, sue your own parents, and then get the documents in your new gender. So all that is kind of shown on this diagram, and again, the video is shot this way, that the creator is drawing this diagram and narrating what he's drawing. And the final one is a good example of that staging of home, right? Staging of a personal space that I was talking about. So this is kind of very messy and kind of, yeah, it looks like a teenager's room, right? And this is, you know, the background that all the videos of that particular YouTuber are made. Okay, so to conclude, I think that those YouTube creators are involved in the invisible labor of translation. Thank you to Sarana Bassi for this term, of invisible labor of translation. And they are involved in intra and interlinguistic processes of translation. So they translate these terms from English into Polish, but they also translate discourses into a language that is understandable, that is intelligible to people who are not familiar with trans issues, right? Because these videos are aimed at other trans people, but also at the general public. They are supposed to be very educational. So they need to find a way to talk about these issues in a way that is clear to people who do not have this kind of experience, right? So I would claim that this is a double kind of translation, intra and interlinguistic. And there are different explanations for why so many multilingual terms are used on YouTube. And I would say we can divide them into linguistic, so something to do with the language itself, right? So one reason could be that there are simply no adequate terms for those issues. And, you know, Polish is not to blame, really, because these are very new things. And also in English, we invent things like a binder, right? Or, I don't know, packing. All these things are new, or at least the meanings. So these are words that have existed in English, but we attach new meanings to them. And then, yeah, other languages may simply take over those new meanings. What Polish may be blamed for is the fact that it is heavily gendered. So there is, for example, this phenomenon of actually, if you want to use an adjective, you just switch to English because it's simply easier than saying all the endings for all the genders. But there are also extra-linguistic explanations. So, for example, English can be seen as a safe space, a space of anonymity, but also a marker of a global community. And yeah, I mentioned those affordances of the different media, which make those kind of different performances possible. And I didn't have that much time to talk about expertness, but I was going to say that the expertness is also built through kind of networking and intertextuality and referring to each other's videos. So these videos are also not made in a vacuum, but they are made in reaction to each other. They, you know, they refer to each other, and in this way, a community is built and a kind of communal discourse is built that adds to this kind of feeling that, yeah, those guys know what they are talking about. They are experts. And the use of humor as a form of social critique, which I think is what's happening with that background, right? So it is very intentional, that background. Yeah, and I think it kind of contributes to the parodic or comedic effect that some of these videos have. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to questions.
So thank you, and thank you also for sticking to time so wonderfully. So we have about 20 minutes for discussion, for question. I have a mic that I will circulate around, not because it amplifies, as I was saying, but because of the recording, so that things will be there. I also have to thank you because you mentioned a number of colleagues and friends of here, personal friends, but also friends of this group. You had a quote from David Grumling and Dutta, and David, of course, was here again as a guest of MIC last year. Serena Bassi is a very dear friend, certainly to myself, Simona here, and working currently at Yale. She had hoped to be here today. Unfortunately, she couldn't, but we'll hope to get her here. here. Well, yeah, no, we did have her name on the screen. I sent her, I took a shot and sent it. You've just been quoted. So I sent her a shot of that. And of course, when you're talking about performativity and translation, there's the work of Cristina Marinetti, who is another colleague and friend with whom we were talking this morning, working very much on that. I'm sure there'll be questions from the audience. I have plenty of questions, but I can ask them later because I'm still having you for a few hours. So I'll see if there are questions around. Shoot your hand and I'll come around with the mic.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I was wondering, to what extent do you think YouTube is a site of cultural imperialism? Because on the one hand, you really show that it's global. I'm thinking about like ASMR. Like you can watch ASMR almost anywhere in the world. But what you're talking about here, where language is used, is it reproducing norms of the US or the UK? Do Polish trans YouTubers know ContraPoints and PhilosophyTube just as well as they would know a really prominent Polish YouTuber? Yeah, like if you could speak to that a little bit.
That's a great question. So actually, the YouTubers that I look at, this is the first generation, so to speak. So they are really, there are no other role models in Poland that they could look up to because they are the first ones. They are really the first trans channels on YouTube in Polish. So the only role models that they had were the English ones, or the British ones, or the American ones, right? So they really do kind of mention Chase Ross regularly, especially kind of the trans men, or others that I showed. So these are the sources of inspiration, which means that as a function of that, there will be patterns that are taken over simply because there is no other source of information to turn to. And the Polish discourse on transgender issues outside of YouTube is extremely essentialist and extremely medicalized. So in order not to draw inspiration from that, you kind of need to follow what is being discussed on the English language YouTube. But as I mentioned, I think that there is also a lot of awareness that these are discourses that are created somewhere in a specific social-cultural context and that they don't necessarily all apply to our situation. A great example for that is that actually the term transgender is not used. So they use the Polish kind of translation of that, which is transpłciowość or transpłciowe. And the English term transgender is not used at all. And I think that's a very conscious decision because of the fact that the term gender is very problematic in Poland, right? And there is this whole kind of anti-gender ideology movement and everything. And I think this was a conscious decision on the part of those creators to refer to themselves as using this Polish term, which does not carry that baggage that the term gender has. So I think that there is definitely kind of a lot of, I would call it inspiration, right? There's a lot of inspiration, but I think it's not a case of passively taking that on board. It is a conscious process and there is a lot of agency. They really do choose what they take to kind of reflect their local experience better.
I find that fascinating because in what you were showing us, that final slide with all the hybridization, the hybridity of that language, and it's so interesting because on the anti-gender ideology side, what you see is either the refusal to translate, but also the idea that if you, implicit in the refusal to translate, which is this idea that this is, foreign stuff that's coming to corrupt, etc., etc. But in implicit in that, there's also the idea that if you were to translate, somehow you would make it ours, and so that kind of, again, very much in brackets, contamination and corruption would come in. But here there's a real refusal of that binarism, so translation is used in this way more creative way rather than in terms of policing the border or letting the enemy in, which is really interesting to me.
Yeah, and a similar thing is happening with non-binary. There is also a Polish term for that, And actually both are used kind of interchangeably, so you can say non-binary and you can say nie-binarne or nie-binarna. But yeah, I think this shows that those processes are kind of there is a conscious kind of strategizing behind that.
I'm not sure if you've been following right now the controversy between ContraPoints and PhilosophyTube over gender dysphoria, and I'm wondering, like, because you said this is the first crop, the first generation of Polish YouTubers, do they tend to be pretty much on the same page, or do you foresee in the future there will be almost like competitions or friendly debates? I'm wondering about the concept of trans trenders, which has come up in, at least in the US on YouTube, the idea that people are co-opting a trans identity for more traffic to YouTube. Do you ever imagine that being part of the Polish discourse, or does that seem too far off?
I am not seeing it yet, and kind of there are three questions there. So let me start with this kind of controversy or the debate about. It's essentially about the question is dysphoria really necessary, right, to identify as trans, to be trans? And it's the PhilosophyTube, which is actually this video that I have a screenshot from, where the kind of concept, so this one, right, about the British healthcare system, and the video argued for the introduction of the informed consent model. And this is actually something that is being discussed in Poland right now. So the YouTubers that I follow have also referred to that in their videos. And this is something that they are very much in favor of. But they are also saying that, you know, every case is different, every case is individual, and whether you experience dysphoria or maybe euphoria or maybe something else should not kind of determine what kind of care you're getting. And the question of the informed consent model is very complicated in Poland because there are certain procedures that the court requires. So while medically it would in theory be possible, choosing the informed consent route would then exclude the possibility of going to court, because that's how you change your gender marker. In Poland, you have to go to court and sue your parents for basically declaring the wrong gender on your birth certificate. That's what happens. So if you do not provide the court with the whole kind of history of tests, medical tests, and this all goes back to this, you know, essentialist kind of medicalized, pathologizing discourse of the APA and the manuals, and so if you are not diagnosed as transsexual, because that's what is still required, you cannot change your gender marker. That's why the informed consent model is not possible in Poland, but it is. They would like it to be possible, right? So this is something that they very much kind of argue for. And the question of transgenders is something that they engage with, but I don't really see that in Poland yet. Although it is something that the right-wing journalists are picking up. So while the phenomenon does not exist in Poland, they are already kind of whipping up a moral panic about it, right? So it's very typical, yes. So yeah.
That's how moral panic works, yes. Any other questions? Yep.
Hi there, thank you for this talk. I was wondering, because you showed us that wonderful list of all of these borrowings and hybridizations, and then went on to say that actually the community was preferring to use Polish language in a lot of these situations. Given that Polish is such a heavily gendered language in nouns, verbs, so on and so forth, I was wondering if there was any consistency emerging in non-binary language between the communities within the community. Thank you.
This is a question that always comes up, and it's a very good one. It's my next project, right? The YouTubers that I look at, they are very much kind of supportive of non-binary identities and non-binary language, while being clear that they identify in binary terms, right? But they are trying to address their audiences in ways that include everyone. And that's kind of one of the reasons why they switched to English in kind of many cases, because in Polish you cannot order a cup of coffee without referring to your own gender, so it's really complicated. And outside of this, there are movements to come up with options for non-binary kind of pronouns, but also endings, right? So just as in Italian or French or German, there are kind of different endings for the masculine gender and for the feminine gender. And in writing, you can do that. So I can give you an example. So for example, I saw, right, would be, this is the feminine, and this is the masculine. So you could do something like this, or something like this, right? Or even, just leave a space. And this is being done. So we see that in kind of left-wing publications that this is definitely being done. More difficult to pronounce that. So and definitely kind of new pronouns coming in. The English way of using the plural is not very possible because of how the language works. But Polish does have a neutral gender, so that is sometimes used. So instead of doing A or E, you will do O. But the problem is that this is reserved for little children and animals, so there is an element of, you will not really be taken seriously if you use that, because it only kind of exists in the third person to refer to children and objects and animals. So this is a new thing. This is, an invention. But there is definitely a discussion about that.
And you say very similar to, well, certainly to the Romance languages, in which we have a similar problem, and again similar sort of strategies are being used in the writing, but then it gets more complicated in the spoken. We're almost there. I don't know if there's a final question that someone wants to ask. Silence. Well, I would love to talk more. One of the things that fascinates me in what you've been talking about in this relationship between language or languages and the fluidity, how the fluidity of language reflects on the one hand this attempt to work through change and transformation, personal, social, and so on, and on the other hand, the rigidity of certain systems. But what fascinates me in particular, and I would love to have that discussion at length, is the question that when you were talking about that articulation of performance and performativity and the issues of fragility that go into that. I think that in itself is a fascinating other area, where that fragility is then also reflected in the way in which rigid or attempts to impose a rigidity to the model of language and to the way in which we constantly creating with language sort of then apply, and how translation can be both the good and the bad guy there, can be both the keeper of the gate, as Naoki Sakai in particular has written about, but it can also be the way in which we work through with real agency through what we want to do. So fascinating, and that's another area. I would like everyone to say thanks to Joanna. We hope to have you here again. We hope to get Serena. We'll try to get David Gramling back at some point, but thank you for today to begin with. Okay, thank you.